Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. Today we are setting the stage for a brand new series exploring the history of the Catholic Church in the United States, beginning with the American Revolution and continuing through the U.S. Civil War. Now, if you're not from the U.S. or don't feel totally confident in your American history knowledge, don't worry. I'll provide plenty of background context along the way. And if you want to dive deeper, I highly recommend checking out the Key Battles of American History podcast by Professor James Early. It's a fantastic podcast series, and I even had the honor of guest hosting one of the series on the War of 1812, which, spoiler alert, will definitely come up in this series. Before we jump along into Catholic-focused narrative and history, today's episode serves as something of a transition, a moment to temper our historical perspective. We're bridging the gap between our last series on the First Temple of Jerusalem and the world of 18th and 19th century Americas. To help prepare you for what's ahead, I also suggest listening to our series entitled End of an Era, which explores the Roman papacy during the dramatic period from the French Revolution to the end of Pope Pius IX's reign in the 1870s. That series really gives critical insight into what was happening in Europe during roughly the same period we'll be covering in American history. You'll find some fascinating comparisons and connections between the Catholic experience in Europe and the emerging United States. Now let's turn to today's episode, a look at a lesser-known chapter of American Christian history, one that doesn't center on the dominant Protestant sects of British North America, nor on the Catholic Church, which, while a minority under British rule, thrived in areas under French and Spanish influence in North America. Instead, we'll explore the life of somebody named Philip Ludwell III and the surprising presence of Orthodox Christianity in colonial Virginia. Now, if this were one of the regular episodes in our Catholic Church and American History series, this would be the part where we would go into the deep backstory, how the church arrived, how it spread, who laid the groundwork. But in this case, there isn't a backstory, at least not the one you might expect, because now we're talking about Orthodox Christians in the New World. And to be honest, this is one of the strangest and most fascinating side paths of the story of Christianity in North America. Yes, the Russians had already started their push eastward across Siberia by the late 1500s. That's a story we don't hear about much in the context of the Age of Exploration, but it absolutely deserves attention. While Spain and Portugal were sailing west, Russia was marching east across a vast and brutal terrain. By the 1740s, Russian traders and settlers had made it to Alaska. That's during the lifetime of this Philip Ludwell III we'll talk about, the man at the center of this transitional episode. But here's the key point. The first organized Orthodox missionary effort in Alaska, the first time we actually see priests, monastics, any kind of religious infrastructure, doesn't happen until 1794. That's almost 30 years after Ludwell's death. And I was all excited to jump into all sorts of this happened and that happened and this happened, Russians in California, et cetera, et cetera. But we can't really talk about it because it happened much later than the time of Philip Ludwell III. So how, in the middle of colonial Virginia, British, aristocratic, deeply Protestant Virginia, do we get someone like Philip Ludwell III converting to Eastern Orthodoxy at a time when even becoming Catholic was considered radical? Ludwell made a leap into a version of Christianity that to most of his contemporaries would have seemed completely foreign, alien, even unheard of. In a religious landscape where not being the right kind of Protestant could get you ostracized, or even worse, how did one of the most American of early Americans become one of the most un-American kinds of Christian you can imagine? That's what we're going to explore in this episode. So you might ask yourself, why are we taking a detour into the life of someone who wasn't Catholic and wasn't even a part of the church we're about to spend a whole series talking about? Because honestly, the story of Philip Ludwell III is exactly the kind of unexpected journey that helps us understand just how complicated and interesting religious life in early America really was. No, Ludwell wasn't Catholic. Back in the British North American colonies, becoming Catholic was strange enough. But most Catholics in the colonies were born into the faith. There weren't a ton of converts. There were even fewer priests, and being Catholic was anything between frowned upon to straight up illegal, depending on where you lived. It was seen as outright treason. Becoming Orthodox, that was all of the above and then some. And Ludwell wasn't some obscure, forgotten colonial, weird foreign colonial type of thing. That's the thing. He wasn't a quote-unquote founding father in the way we would usually talk about them, but he was deeply connected to the elite of colonial society. I'll be honest myself, I hadn't heard of him until fairly recently, and I bet most of you haven't either. But if you're listening at this point, chances are you're more into history than the average person. We all know that. As we'll see, Philip Ludwell III was one of the wealthiest, most connected, and most influential people in the 13 colonies before the American Revolution. Even though he died in 1767, nearly a decade before the 4th of July, 1776, his influences ran deep. So yes, his conversion to Orthodoxy is worth exploring, but so is the man himself. So let's get into our rewind now. Ludwell's story begins with his grandfather, Philip Ludwell I, born in England in 1638. He came to the Americas and he got to work fast. He became the first governor of the Carolinas. That was South and North Carolina merged into one. They would later split. He married into Virginia's oldest and most powerful family and fought on the side of the government during Bacon's Rebellion. He held seats in the House of Burgesses and many other major offices. Ludwell's son, Philip II, inherited his father's wealth and continued the family's rise. When Ludwell I returned to England and died there, his estate and his influence passed on to his son, who further expanded the family's political clout. He played a key role in the early development of the College of William and Mary and continued the Ludwell tradition of civic leadership. That brings us to Philip Ludwell III, born in 1716 into this world of wealth and privilege and political power. He would go on to become the largest landowner in Virginia, which at the time was the wealthiest of the 13 colonies. So in terms of scale, Ludwell was right up there with the most powerful figures in all of British North America. You just can't discount that. largest landowner in the wealthiest colony. That's no joke right there. He's as serious as anybody. His family ties only deepen this picture as well. His sister Lucy Ludwell married into the Lee family, one of the most important and aristocratic families in Virginia, which this family would produce multiple revolutionary leaders, and eventually Robert E. Lee himself, the most famous Virginian of the 19th century and maybe of all time. And Philip Ludwell himself, he wasn't just wealthy and well-connected. He was also extremely learned, culturally refined, and active in politics and education. He was close friends, you might even call him besties, with Benjamin Franklin, and he gave George Washington his first military commission. This military commission of George Washington would lead to something called the French and Indian War, which would lead to the 7 Years' War, which eventually would lead to the American Revolution. Key figure in there, Philip Ludwell III. Philip Ludwell III was a militia commander, so he would often be referred to as Colonel Ludwell. Maybe we'll start referring to him as Colonel from now on. Then in 1737, at about the age of 20, Colonel Ludwell, sailed to London with his wife and assistant/manservant John Wales. This was kind of a typical trip for wealthy Virginians, many of whom spent long stretches of time in England. But Ludwell did something very atypical. He visited the Russian Orthodox Mission Church in London, which still incidentally exists to this day, and asked to be received into the Orthodox Church. Let's let that sink in for a second. Here's a young Virginian aristocrat at the height of British Protestant society, voluntarily stepping into the most foreign version of Christianity that was available at that time. One with zero foothold in North America, no local church, no community, and no clergy. And that's what he joined anyway. Now, Ludwell didn't travel alone. Along with his wife, like I said, he brought this fellow John Wales, a man who you may not have heard of him in particular, but his name is connected to a lot of big names in U.S. history. Wales's daughter, Martha, would go on to marry Thomas Jefferson. He also fathered several children with enslaved women, including one daughter named Sally Hemings, Jefferson's mistress and the mother of several of his children. Man, let that sink in for a minute. Thomas Jefferson's wife and mistress had the same dad. One, the daughter of wealth and privilege and everything that comes with that legitimate line, and the other a slave. I mean, that's just craziness. So yes, this story touches on one of the most foundational and controversial corners of American history. So after his conversion, Ludwell returned to Virginia and had 3 daughters who lived to adulthood. He had technically 4 daughters, but as was common in the day, one did not make it into adulthood. And he remained openly Orthodox, or as much as he could be. He translated the divine liturgies of St. John Chrysostom and St. Basil the Great into English, which were, and still to this day, are the 2 most central services of the Orthodox Church. Every Sunday service in almost all or Eastern Orthodox jurisdictions are going to be either St. John Chrysostom's liturgy or St. Basil the Great. Sometimes, very rarely, one other liturgy is used, but that's very infrequent. Among his other translations were a key Russian catechism and a special liturgy held primarily during Lent called the Divine and Holy Liturgy of St. Gregory the Dialogist, or it's more often called the Liturgy of the Pre-Sanctified Gifts. As a little interesting side note, this liturgy ties directly back to Rome. Gregory the Dialogist is another name for Pope Gregory the Great, who reigned in the late 500s and early 600s. When he was a young man, he spent time in Constantinople, where he created this liturgy. It became extremely popular in the East, but never quite caught on in the West. Pope St. Gregory the Great is another person like Ludwell who has all sorts of interesting and unexpected cross-cultural connections. Ludwell built a fairly standard home in Williamsburg, Virginia. Definitely luxurious, don't get me wrong there, but for the most part, well within the norms of architectural standards. But there was one major exception. The basement of the home featured an apse, a rounded recess in the eastern wall, a distinctly Orthodox Christian architectural Eastern feature. It's not something you'd expect in a colonial Virginia home, and it actually caused issues with the building's foundation. The Ludwell Paradise House still stands in colonial Williamsburg to this day, but unfortunately, I guess, or unfortunately, depending how you want to look at it, it's a privately owned building and is privately occupied. So the archaeological research really hasn't moved forward much in recent years. But back to the narrative, in 1760, Ludwell returned to London, maybe permanently or maybe just for another visit. For Ludwell, it would be permanent, but we'll see why. So while back in merry old London, he had his 3 daughters received into the Orthodox Church and requested permission to take Holy Communion home with him back to Virginia, along with permission for it to be shipped once per year. That might seem odd today, but at the time, it was normal for Catholics and Orthodox Christians to receive communion only once a year, especially if they lived in isolated areas. But as we said earlier, Ludwell never did make it back home to Virginia. He died in London in 1767 and was buried with Orthodox Christian rites. Coming in up next, we'll look at the aftermath of Ludwell's conversion, how his legacy rippled through early American history, and what this really unlikely story tells us about religion, identity, and faith choice in colonial America. Hey, Steve here. If you're enjoying the History of the Papacy podcast, consider joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We're working toward going completely listener funded, which means no more ads ever. When you join, you get early access to episodes, monthly book giveaways, and most importantly, your name is added to the History of the Papacy Diptychs, our own list of commemorated supporters. You can become an Antioch level supporter for just $3 per month, but it makes a huge difference to making the History of the Papacy ad-free and independent. Nobody likes ads, not you, not me, and I'm the guy who records them. So let's just get rid of them. Visit patreon.com/History of the Papacy and join today. So let's talk about Philip Ludwell III's legacy and kind of what happens after the fact. And the rest of the story, you might say, because he's one of those historical figures who just barely missed being a household name. I think that's what's really important about him. Ludwell died just a little too early, 1767 to be exact. If he had lived into the 1770s, I think there's a solid case, and probably more than that, to be made that he would have been a major player, at very least a major player on the Patriots' side during the American Revolution. Look at his good pal, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin lived until 1790 and had a hand in almost every major political and diplomatic moment of that era. Ludwell may not have had Franklin's knack for publicity, but he was wealthy, connected, and thoughtful. He might not have been out there leading troops despite being a colonel, but I bet he would have been one of the major financiers and influencers behind the patriot cause. Now, here's the real question, the one that keeps coming back to me, and it's probably coming back to you too. How does a 20-year-old Virginia aristocrat in the middle of the 1700s become an Orthodox Christian? Where does he learn about it? The really sad part of it is, or the frustrating part, depending on where you come from on this, is we don't know. We just don't know. And I mean that in the most literal sense. There's no conversion story, no spiritual diary, no 18th century blog post titled Why I Left Anglicanism, or my story from Williamsburg to Byzantium, or anything like that. Ludwell just shows up in London, already committed to the Orthodox Church and faith, and the Orthodox clergy there don't seem to have much of a problem receiving him, which is remarkable in and of itself. There's one researcher I have to mention here, and his name is Nicholas Chapman. He's a British-American Orthodox scholar who's been digging deep into this story for years, and I mean really digging. He's been scouring musty archives in Britain, poring over colonial documents in Williamsburg, New Orleans, and even Texas, searching for any shred of information about Ludwell and his descendants. It's historical detective work at its finest. So far, there's no smoking gun and no moment where Ludwell declares, here's why I'm going to become Orthodox. But there are some intriguing clues, and I think we can reasonably infer a few things. First, Ludwell was incredibly well-read. For someone his age, especially in the colonial world, his depth of learning is impressive. He knew Greek, and that's no small thing right there. It means he had access to and could understand primary Christian sources, the early church fathers, scripture in their original languages, theological writings most of his peers wouldn't have even thought about touching. It's very possible that in comparing what he read in the early sources to what he saw around him in Anglicanism or even Roman Catholicism, he found something lacking. When he encountered Eastern Orthodoxy, something about it just clicked. It may have felt closer to what he understood ancient Christianity to be, and it was just outsider and cool too. Now, it's worth noting the Anglicanism of Ludwell's time, especially in its high church form, wasn't as far removed from Catholicism or Orthodoxy as we often might imagine today. So maybe the jump to Orthodoxy wasn't quite as unthinkable as it seems from our modern lens. But still, why not just become a Catholic? Well, for Ludwell, that may have been off the table from the start. The Catholic brand, you might call it, in colonial Virginia was not great. There was deep suspicion of Rome, the Papacy, the Curia, and all the political baggage that came with it, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, monarchy versus Pope dynamics. Ludwell knew his history, and I bet that knowledge didn't make Rome look quite as appealing. So maybe Orthodoxy seemed like a clean slate. It had a deep apostolic roots. It had liturgy, sacraments, hierarchy, but without all the entanglements of the Vatican or the memory of centuries of European religious wars. Maybe to someone like Ludwell, Orthodoxy wasn't foreign, it was fresh. Whatever his reasons, his decision stands out, not just as a curiosity, but as a challenge to our assumptions about what religion looked like in early America. So let's keep digging into this legacy of Philip Ludwell III, because as we dig deeper, it becomes clear that his story wasn't just a personal one. It had ripples and effects that just went across religion, property, and generations of family influence. When it comes to religion, Ludwell may have been ahead of his time in more ways than one. While he didn't exactly start a movement, it seems he had at least some intention of spreading Orthodox Christianity. He received a formal blessing to translate and publish an important Orthodox catechism into English. That's a big deal, especially in a religious tradition that was still very much anchored in Greek, Slavonic, and Arabic. He also wrote at least one semi-apologetical treatise, kind of an early attempt to explain or defend his faith to a Western audience. He brought his daughters to London to be received into the Orthodox Church. That alone would have taken serious conviction, time, and money. He also designed his home in Williamsburg, this Ludwell Paradise House, in a way that made it suitable for holding Orthodox services. We don't know 100% if he did, but it's pretty likely that that's what that basement was designed for. His daughter Lucy would later marry a man named John Paradise, and we'll get back to him in just a second. But first, let's talk about what Ludwell didn't do. He didn't bring a priest back to the colonies. Now, we shouldn't be too quick to judge that decision. Getting an Orthodox priest to the British colonies in the 1700s would have been a logistical nightmare. Even the Russian Orthodox Church in London, which was better connected and closer to the Orthodox centers, had a hard time keeping their parish staffed with clergy. In fact, Ludwell went 20 years without taking communion. That's a long time and raises a fair question. Was orthodoxy, at least early on, more of an intellectual commitment than a fully sacramental one? It's possible. But by the time he returned to London later in life, he seems to have definitely taken things seriously, bringing his family into the church and participating more fully in the religious life of the Russian parish there. Now, that parish was interesting. It wasn't just Russian, even though it's called the Russian Mission. It was a pan-Orthodox affair. There were native English converts with several families, Greek immigrants from Alexandria in Egypt, and even Italians. The clergy included Athonite monks and Russian priests, all serving in this melting pot congregation in the heart of London, which brings us back to Ludwell's daughters, particularly Lucy. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. So one of his daughters married into the Lee family. Yes, those Lees again. Another daughter, Lucy, married John Paradise, an Anglo-Greek linguist and intellectual. John Paradise was born in Thessaloniki, which was part of the Ottoman Empire at that time. His father was a British trader and official, and his mother was likely born Orthodox. So Paradise was born and raised in the faith from his birth, and John Paradise was no intellectual lightweight. He was a member of the Royal Society and a close friend of many of the top intellectuals of the day, including Samuel Johnson, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, you name it. He was fluent in Greek, Latin, English, Turkish, French, and Italian. So yeah, kind of a genius. He eventually became one of the first naturalized American citizens, and he and Lucy moved back to Virginia, where they lived in the Ludwell Paradise House. Not surprisingly, they mingled with the elite circles of early American society, spending time and even partying with George Washington and other founding figures. John died in 1795 while in England. Lucy returned to Virginia and continued to practice her Orthodox faith. Yes, you heard that. There was a practicing Orthodox Christian woman living in 19th century Virginia, keeping the faith alive. She even kept in contact with President Thomas Jefferson, who checked in on her health and well-being quite often. And Lucy responded in a way that's both touching and historically incredible. She wrote, "With the blessing of God, I am now in good health, and with my priest's blessing and command, who is the Reverend Mr. Smirnoff, Yes, her priest was named Father Yakov Smirnov, and yes, depending on your age, that name might get a chuckle. What the country? Like this episode if you get the reference, share it if you don't. But all jokes aside, Lucy's story ends with kind of a sad note. She struggled with what then was called madness and what now we would call some sort of depressive mental illness. She died in 1814 in a Virginia mental hospital. Lucy and John had a daughter named Lucy Paradise, and her story will stretch this strange and beautiful thread of American Orthodoxy all the way to the 1860s, where it will intersect again with the expanding American Catholic Church and the broader religious currents of that time, really bringing us to the end of this series and the end of our timeline. So let's finish this winding journey with a name that sounds like something out of a kind of a satirical novel, but is 100% real. Decimus et ultimus Bar Ziza, literally the 10th and last Bar Ziza. Decimus's dad had what you might call a true gift for naming. So what his name is, it's Latin for 10th and last. By the way, that tells you how many children Decimus at Ultimus's family had before him. And yes, his name alone would have made him a really cool historical footnote, but his story is far more than just a little curio in our cabinet. Decimus was born into a lineage that spanned the Italian aristocracy and the Virginian aristocracy and the Orthodox Christian underground in early America. He ended up living in Texas. He served the Confederate Army and became a politician. But let's back up a few steps and see how we get from Philip Ludwell III to this really unorthodox Texan. So here's the short story. Lucy Paradise, daughter of Lucy Ludwell, who was the daughter of Philip Ludwell III, and John Paradise, married a Venetian count named Antonio Barziza. They had a son, Filippo Barziza. Wonder where that name Filippo came. So this Filippo started to go by Philip Barziza and made his way to America after the death of his grandmother, Lucy Paradise. What was his goal? His goal was to claim the Ludwell family inheritance. So a real big, nice chunk of property and wealth in Virginia. This move was reportedly encouraged by none other than Thomas Jefferson himself, who had been the family's legal advisor and, of course, friends. But there was a problem. At the time, Virginia law prohibited foreign-born individuals from inheriting any sort of property. Even though Barziza renounced his aristocratic title back in Italy, became an American citizen, and did everything by the book, he ran straight into legal hurdles. He fought hard, but eventually lost, and this was a case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The legal fight really financially ruined him. So he moved his family to Galveston, Texas, where his son Decimus et Ultimus had already begun building a life. He went to school at Baylor, established himself in the law, and got involved in Texas politics. The Barziza family became deeply involved in the major issues of the day. They supported secession, participated in the political and military leadership of Confederate Texas, and like many elites of their time and place, they owned and traded in enslaved people. It's a stark reminder that even in these fascinating and unexpected religious lineages, we're still dealing with human beings who are flawed, privileged, and deeply embedded in the structures of their ages. You just can't discount that they are 360-degree people, not just pictures on a flat page. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors. There's one more thread that we need to follow, and there's tantalizing evidence that's still being currently researched right now is that the Barziza family may have continued practicing Orthodox Christianity all through the ages, all the way up into their time in Texas. Certain records suggest that at least some elements of Orthodox belief and practice were being passed down. We don't have definitive proof yet. There is a line of genealogical and ecclesiastical research that continues to this day, and that, believe it or not, brings us all the way back around to the main series, because at the time we're in the 1860s, these threads of Orthodoxy, Catholicism, immigration, and American identity will all begin to collide in new and really surprising ways. From Philip Ludwell to the Orthodox Church, to Virginia, to Venice, to Texas. This is really a story of faith, identity, and a very different kind of American religious history that we just don't hear much about, and really connects us to every aspect of American history that we're going to talk about in this series. So before we close out, there's just one topic that we really do need to address, because we can't tell the story honestly without it, and that's slavery. It's a theme that will return again and again in our main series, but we have to at least start unpacking it here, because as much as this has been a story about faith and politics and identity and religion, it's also a story about power, and slavery was at the center of this power, and there's going to be other aspects of religion that will definitely have to do with power. Philip Ludwell III, this pioneering Orthodox convert, this really deeply religious man, owned enslaved people, or slaves, a lot of them. Across all of his holdings, Ludwell held up to 235 enslaved Africans. He wasn't the largest slaveholder of his class, despite being the largest landowner, but that number still places him firmly in the plantation elite of colonial Virginia. It's important to remember that slavery was entirely legal at this time. The laws around importing enslaved people from abroad and the rules about manumission or freeing slaves would shift over time, but during Ludwell's life, slaveholding was just accepted. It was a central part of the economy and the culture. What's more difficult, maybe more disturbing, is that highly religious people participated in this system. Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholics, Jesuit priests, many of them owned slaves. This wasn't seen as a contradiction by most of their contemporaries. The traditional Christian view was not necessarily anti-slavery. It didn't love slavery, and it was opposed to the mistreatment of slaves. In theory, though, enslaved people were to be treated with dignity, taught the Christian faith, and recognized as spiritual equals. Your status in life, be you slave or free, king or commoner, was central to your identity in Christ. So, and to quote the famous Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And this passage is often cited in Christian theology, not to reject the institution of slavery itself, but to emphasize the spiritual equality within the existing social order. Slavery, like gender or nationality, was viewed as one of the many stations in life where you were expected to live out your Christian calling. To the modern Western mind, that's about as upside down as it gets. But this was the worldview Ludwell and many others operated within. Now, to be fair, even in this era, there were cracks in that system, especially as the Enlightenment took hold. Many of the founding fathers, steeped in the Enlightenment ideals, knew deep down that slavery was not compatible with the ideals of liberty and human dignity that they were preaching. But they didn't all respond the same way. Some, like William Ludwell III, Philip's nephew, took action. He freed his slaves. Others wrote passionate letters about the evil of slavery while continuing to make a profit from it. And many more just simply ignored or kicked the can down the road on that contradiction altogether. As for the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church in America in particular, its relationship with slavery was equally complicated. That's a subject we'll tackle in far more detail as our main series unfolds, because to understand Catholicism in America from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War, we have to understand not just the doctrines and devotions, but the systems of power, property, and prejudice that shaped the Church's place in society. So where does this leave us? Honestly, we barely scratched the surface. The story of Philip Ludwell III, his family, and their role in both Christian history and American history is still unfolding. Scholars are just beginning to piece it all together. Archives are just beginning to be explored. Letters and legal documents are being re-examined, and every new detail only adds more complexity to the legacy. But for our purposes today, I hope this episode just gave you something deeper, a taste of the strange, rich, and sometimes uncomfortable layers that exist just under the surface of American religious history. And I think this is the perfect place to launch our next series, The History of the Catholic Church in the United States, from Revolutionary War to Civil War. These stories just don't run parallel. They intersect in ways that will surprise you. New episodes coming soon, and I hope to see you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the Popes of Rome, Christian Church, and American history.
The Historical Jesus Podcast is the sweeping saga of the life and times of Galilean Jesus of Nazareth, as well as the faith, religion, and church founded to honor and disseminate his acts and teachings. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this fascinating journey through time, exploring the many great works of Christian theology, literature, architecture, music, and art inspired by the words and deeds of Jesus Christ.